250 million years ago, Earth was in a long period of relative stability. The oceans were full, forests covered the land, life was everywhere. At the surface, the planet appeared calm and familiar, but beneath that appearance, the systems that had supported life for millions of years were beginning to change. All of Earth's land was joined into a single massive supercontinent, stretching nearly from pole to pole. Along its edges, moisture and life remained abundant, but far inland, heat built up, rain became rare, rivers dried out, seasons arrived without relief. Life still survived, but the margins were shrinking. Oxygen levels that once supported large active animals began to fall. Carbon dioxide rose unevenly. Breathing became harder. Growth slowed. Survival favored efficiency over size, endurance over speed. In the oceans, the surface looked unchanged. But deeper down, circulation weakened. Waters lost oxygen. Food webs became unstable from the bottom upward. On land and in the sea, ecosystems continued to function, but with nothing left in reserve. But how long can a planet appear stable while its foundations are eroding? Tonight, we travel back to this ancient Earth that still seemed stable just before its systems began to fail. But before we begin, if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight, and what time is it there? It's always a joy to see how far across the world this little sleepy corner of science travels. Now, take a deep breath, close your eyes, let your shoulders soften, and let's step gently into the world as it was then. The land did not drift or wander. It locked itself together, continent by continent, until nearly every major mass of Earth's surface formed a single continuous body. Coastlines stretched outward in long arcs, but the interior grew vast and enclosed, far from the moderating influence of the sea. This new arrangement changed more than geography. It rewired the planet's ability to move heat, moisture, and energy across its surface. With the continents fused, the oceans lost their familiar circulation patterns. Currents that once carried warmth from equator to pole slowed or failed altogether. Heat pooled where it was trapped and escaped less easily where it was needed. The seas still moved, tides still rose and fell, but the deeper exchange that once balanced climates across the globe became uneven and strained. Temperature differences sharpened, lingering longer instead of smoothing out with the seasons. Across the massive land interior, distance itself became an environmental force. Moisture released from coastal waters struggled to travel inland. Clouds thinned as they crossed the broad plains. Rainfall became unreliable, sometimes absent for years at a time. Where water did arrive, it often came violently, briefly, and then vanished. Rivers that depended on steady replenishment weakened, shrank, or disappeared between wet cycles. Weather settled into persistence rather than variety. Dry periods stretched across decades. Heat waves lingered far beyond a single season. Cold snaps, when they came, held fast instead of passing quickly. These were not sudden catastrophes, but long grinding patterns that reshaped the expectations of life. Survival no longer depended on outrunning a storm or enduring a short hardship. It required patience across generations. Plants adapted by growing slowly, investing more in roots than height. Animal life shifted toward forms that could tolerate long shortages, conserving water and energy rather than expending it freely. Movement became cautious. Migration routes shortened. The land rewarded endurance over ambition, consistency over exploration. The scale of the supercontinent amplified every imbalance. With no opposing landmasses to redirect winds or break heat circulation, the climate behaved as a single connected system. A drought in one region influenced air patterns thousands of kilometers away. A prolonged warm period altered rainfall far beyond its point of origin. The planet no longer offered isolated refuges from its own extremes. Over time, this unity became a constraint. What once allowed stability through balance now enforced uniform stress. The land breathed together, heated together, and dried together. Life continued across this immense surface, adapted and persistent, but it did so under conditions that left little room for recovery. The climate no longer fluctuated gently. It held steady pressures, pressing slowly and continuously, shaping a world where endurance became the defining trait of survival. At the heart of the supercontinent, distance itself shaped the land. Far from any coastline, the air grew thinner of moisture with every passing season. Clouds weakened as they traveled inland, releasing little before dissolving entirely. What rain did arrive often vanished quickly, absorbed by heat or carried away in short lived floods that left little behind. Over time, this interior became defined not by what it received, but by what it was denied. The ground hardened under prolonged dryness. Soils lost the softness needed to retain water, turning brittle and pale beneath the sun. Vegetation adapted by shrinking, spreading roots wider and deeper rather than growing tall. Large stretches of land supported only sparse plant life, separated by open ground that baked for much of the year. Shade became rare. Shelter came less from trees and more from burrows, rock outcrops, and the land's own contours. Temperature extremes followed naturally. Without nearby oceans to soften daily and seasonal shifts, heat built relentlessly during long summers. Days stretched under intense warmth, while nights could cool abruptly once the sun slipped away. Winters brought their own challenges, with colder conditions settling in for extended periods. These changes did not arrive suddenly or violently. They repeated year after year, carving predictability into hardship. Water dictated every movement. Rivers appeared briefly after rare rains, then receded into dry channels that marked where life once flowed. Animals learned to cluster around temporary water sources, timing their activity to avoid the harshest heat. Travel became deliberate, conserving energy rather than exploring new ground. The interior rewarded restraint and punished excess. Bodies themselves reflected the pressure. Many animals favored compact forms that reduced water loss and retained heat more efficiently. Growth slowed across generations. Metabolism adjusted downward, allowing survival on limited resources. Movement became purposeful, conserving energy rather than expending it in bursts. Endurance mattered more than strength, patience more than speed. These deserts were not empty, but they offered little margin for error. A slightly longer dry season could erase entire populations from a region. A minor shift in temperature could tip plants past their tolerance, removing the foundation of local food webs. Life continued, adapted and persistent, but always near its limits. Across these vast interior stretches, biological abundance narrowed. Diversity remained, but abundance thinned. Ecosystems simplified, relying on fewer species and fewer connections. Stability depended on delicate balances that left little capacity for recovery. Each surviving organism carried the imprint of the land's demands, shaped by scarcity rather than opportunity. The great interior deserts did not dominate the planet's surface, but they influenced its character deeply. They became places where life learned caution, efficiency, and restraint. Over millions of years, this quiet pressure spread its influence outward, shaping not just the land itself, but the rules by which survival would be measured across the supercontinent. From above, the oceans kept their familiar rhythm. Waves rose and fell along the coasts, sunlight scattered across shallow waters, and surface life continued its ancient routines. Reefs still formed intricate shapes near shorelines. Schools of fish moved through warm layers, following cycles that had endured for ages. To any distant observer, the seas looked steady, generous, and unchanged, offering no hint of the subtle shifts unfolding beneath their surface. Below the reach of light, the water told a quieter story. As temperatures changed across the planet, the slow sinking and rising of ocean layers weakened. Warm surface water mixed less readily with colder depths. This separation reduced the delivery of oxygen to deeper zones, thinning the breathable space for countless organisms. Where currents once refreshed the seafloor, stillness began to linger, and oxygen dwindled without drama or sudden collapse. These changes altered chemistry long before they altered appearance. In poorly mixed waters, nutrients accumulated where they were least useful. Organic material drifted downward and gathered, feeding microbial processes that consumed even more oxygen. Pockets of water grew stagnant, supporting fewer complex forms of life. The ocean did not empty itself. Instead, it quietly narrowed the range of conditions where life could thrive. Near the surface, food chains still appeared intact. Plankton bloomed with the seasons, and predators followed familiar migrations. Yet the foundation beneath these patterns was thinning. As deep waters lost oxygen, they became less capable of supporting the organisms that recycled nutrients back upward. This slowed the entire system, weakening the feedbacks that had long kept marine ecosystems resilient. Over time, the strain reached upward. Some species became confined to narrower depth ranges, pressed between warm surface waters and inhospitable depths below. Others adapted by slowing growth or reducing activity, conserving energy where oxygen was scarce. Diversity remained, but it depended increasingly on stability that no longer came easily. The oceans absorbed change with patience. Their vastness disguised vulnerability, allowing imbalance to persist unnoticed for long stretches of time. Nothing appeared broken at the surface. Life still glimmered in sunlit waters. Yet beneath, the connections that sustained abundance were loosening, link by link. This quiet reorganization reshaped marine life without spectacle. It replaced flexibility with fragility, abundance with precision. The sea continued to function, but with fewer paths for recovery and fewer margins for error. Long before any visible collapse, the oceans had already begun rewriting the conditions under which survival was possible, settling into a state that looked calm while slowly becoming something new. Air is easy to overlook when it is abundant. It surrounds life without drawing attention, shaping bodies quietly across deep time. Earlier in Earth's history, oxygen had filled the atmosphere more generously, allowing large bodies, rapid movement, and energetic metabolisms to flourish. By this point in the planet's story, that invisible support was beginning to thin, not abruptly, but steadily, with consequences that reached into every ecosystem. As oxygen levels declined, the cost of simply staying alive increased. Every breath delivered less energy to muscles and organs. Growth demanded more time. Recovery required longer rest. The atmosphere still sustained life, but it no longer offered excess. What had once been easy became something to manage carefully, especially for large animals whose size demanded constant oxygen flow. Bodies began to reflect this constraint. Extremely large forms became harder to maintain, not because food vanished, but because oxygen could no longer move efficiently through thick tissues. Many species favored compact builds, reducing the distance between air and muscle. Others developed slower life rhythms, conserving energy rather than expending it freely. Movement shifted from bursts of speed to measured endurance, matched to the limits of the air itself. Breathing shaped anatomy in subtle ways. Barrel-shaped chests appeared more often, allowing greater lung capacity without increasing overall size. Muscles became denser, optimized for steady output rather than sudden force. Even posture changed in some lineages, spreading weight in ways that reduced strain and improved stability. These adjustments accumulated quietly across generations, guided not by catastrophe, but by gradual pressure. The effects extended beyond individual bodies. Ecosystems adjusted as fewer species could dominate through sheer size or speed. Food webs favored balance over extremes. Predators relied more on persistence and timing than overwhelming power. Prey species benefited from efficiency, using less oxygen to sustain daily activity. Survival became less about outcompeting rivals and more about fitting precisely within shrinking margins. Lower oxygen also narrowed developmental pathways. Juvenile growth stages took longer, increasing vulnerability early in life. Reproduction became a careful investment, favoring fewer offspring with higher chances of survival. These shifts slowed the pace of change, encouraging stability over experimentation. Evolution continued, but with fewer bold departures from proven designs. This atmospheric change did not announce itself with dramatic signs. Skies remained blue, winds continued their familiar patterns. Yet the air carried a quieter influence, shaping life from the inside out. Every heartbeat, every movement, every growth decision was touched by the availability of oxygen, linking biology directly to chemistry. Over time, breathing itself became a filter through which survival passed. Species that aligned their demands with the air endured. Those that relied on abundance found themselves pressed against limits they could not cross. The planet remained alive and complex, but the freedom once granted by its atmosphere was fading, replaced by a more exacting balance where even the air imposed its own quiet discipline. The land expressed itself through older rhythms of growth. There were no open meadows rippling in the wind, no fields shaped by grasses bending and returning with ease. The ground was claimed instead by plants that grew slowly and held their space for centuries. Forests rose with a different posture, built from ancient lineages that favored persistence over renewal, weight over flexibility. These forests were not bright or airy. Their canopies filtered light heavily, allowing only muted tones to reach the forest floor. Broad fronds, thick needles, and rigid leaves formed overlapping layers, creating shaded interiors where humidity lingered and air moved sluggishly. Without flowering plants to introduce bursts of color or seasonal change, the landscape remained visually steady, bound to long cycles that rarely announced themselves. Plant reproduction followed quieter paths. Spores drifted rather than seeds traveling with animals or wind. Pollination did not depend on insects moving between blossoms, but on moisture, proximity, and time. This slowed the pace of ecological exchange, favoring stability and continuity over rapid expansion. Forests changed gradually, their boundaries shifting over generations rather than seasons. Without grasses to bind soil or spread quickly after disturbance, open ground recovered slowly. Forest gaps remained bare longer, sometimes filling with low vegetation that struggled to take hold. Fires, when they occurred, altered landscapes in lasting ways, as regrowth required patience rather than speed. The land carried the memory of disturbance for extended stretches of time. Animal life adapted to this structure. Without flowering plants to diversify food sources, diets depended heavily on leaves, stems, spores, and tough plant tissues. Herbivores grew strong jaws and durable teeth, capable of processing fibrous material with limited nutritional reward. Feeding required effort, and digestion demanded efficiency. Energy moved through the system more slowly, constrained by the nature of the plants at its base. The absence of birds shaped the soundscape as much as the ecology. Forests lacked the constant motion of wings and calls overhead. Movement came instead from the ground and lower canopy, measured and deliberate. Insects still existed, but without flowering plants, their roles were different, tied less to pollination and more to decomposition and recycling of plant matter. Food webs reflected this older architecture. Energy flowed upward from resilient plants through a limited set of herbivores and on to predators adapted for endurance rather than speed. The system favored balance over abundance. With fewer shortcuts for energy transfer, each layer depended closely on the one below it. Across the land, this vegetation created a sense of density and weight. Growth accumulated rather than turning over quickly. Landscapes felt settled, shaped by long persistence instead of rapid change. Life thrived within these constraints, supported by plant foundations that had evolved for an Earth still governed by ancient rules, where continuity mattered more than flexibility, and survival rested on enduring forms that rarely hurried. The land moved with a different kind of confidence. Across plains, forests, and river margins, the dominant shapes were low, broad, and deliberate. Mammals had not yet arrived to test the ground with quick steps or restless curiosity. Instead, the world belonged to reptile-like animals whose presence felt settled, as though they were extensions of the terrain itself. These creatures filled nearly every major role on land. Some grazed slowly on tough vegetation, others hunted with patience rather than pursuit. Their bodies were often thick through the torso, supported by sprawling limbs that spread weight outward instead of lifting it high. This posture kept them close to the ground, conserving energy and providing stability across uneven surfaces shaped by heat, drought, and long seasons of strain. Growth followed a measured pace. Without the rapid metabolisms that would later define mammals, these animals took time to mature. Energy flowed steadily rather than quickly, allowing bodies to endure on limited resources. Muscle was dense rather than explosive, designed for sustained effort rather than sudden speed. Movement favored endurance, the ability to continue when conditions demanded persistence over long stretches of time. This physiology matched the planet's demands. Food could be scarce or difficult to process. Water might appear briefly and then vanish for extended periods. Animals that rushed burned precious reserves. Those that moved carefully and conserved heat survived more reliably. Thick skin reduced moisture loss. Slow breathing aligned with thinner oxygen. Every trait leaned toward efficiency rather than excess. Predation followed the same logic. Hunts unfolded as calculated events rather than frantic chases. Ambush and timing mattered more than acceleration. A successful strike relied on patience, positioning, and the ability to wait without wasting energy. Even confrontations between animals reflected this balance, with strength measured in endurance rather than speed. Reproduction mirrored the rhythm of survival. Fewer offspring were produced, each requiring significant investment. Development progressed steadily, preparing juveniles for a world that rewarded consistency. There was little room for reckless growth or fragile designs. Lineages persisted by remaining adaptable within narrow bounds, not by taking evolutionary risks. This dominance did not create a monotonous world. Diversity existed within these forms, expressed through variations in size, diet, and behavior. Yet beneath that variety ran a shared strategy, one shaped by long exposure to environmental pressure. Stability became the defining advantage. Animals that fit smoothly into their surroundings endured, while those that pushed boundaries struggled to maintain themselves. Over millions of years, this way of life established a quiet order across the land. Reptile like animals did not rush toward the future. They held the present firmly, balanced between resource limits and bodily demands. The planet responded by shaping them into forms that matched its pace, steady and unhurried, perfectly suited to a world where survival depended not on being fast, but on lasting long enough for the next season to arrive. Form followed pressure more closely than familiarity. Across the land, bodies took on silhouettes that would feel unusual to modern eyes, not decorative or excessive, but shaped by precise needs imposed by heat, breath, and endurance. These animals carried the history of their environment in their outlines, each curve and extension reflecting challenges that persisted year after year. Among the most striking were those with tall, sail-like structures rising from their backs. These were not ornaments or displays in the modern sense. They altered how bodies interacted with sunlight and air, catching warmth in cooler moments and shedding it when conditions grew oppressive. Blood vessels spread through these surfaces, allowing heat to move deliberately rather than chaotically. In a world where temperature swung widely and relief was rare, such structures offered control without speed. Other bodies widened rather than rose. Thick torsos and barrel-shaped chests expanded internal space without increasing height, supporting steady breathing and prolonged activity. These forms worked quietly, accommodating lungs and organs suited for environments where oxygen delivered less energy than it once had. The shape did not signal power or aggression. It signaled balance, a careful alignment between demand and supply. Limbs told a similar story. Many extended outward from the body instead of lifting it high, distributing weight evenly and conserving energy during movement. This posture reduced strain on joints and muscles, allowing animals to travel across uneven, often unforgiving ground without unnecessary effort. The land rewarded this closeness to the surface, this refusal to rise above conditions that could not be escaped. Skin and muscle contributed to the same design language. Thick layers reduced water loss and buffered temperature changes. Muscle favored steady output over sudden force. Every trait leaned toward moderation, preserving energy rather than releasing it quickly. These animals did not rush through their environments. They matched them. Development followed suit. Growth was gradual, allowing bodies to adjust as conditions shifted slowly over time. Juveniles resembled smaller versions of adults rather than fragile intermediates, increasing their chances in a world that offered little forgiveness. Reproductive strategies favored continuity, passing on forms that had already proven resilient. This was not experimentation for its own sake. Evolution worked within narrow boundaries, solving practical problems imposed by the planet's constraints. It explored solutions that are rarely seen today because the pressures that shaped them no longer dominate. The challenges of prolonged heat, limited oxygen, and persistent scarcity demanded responses that favored regulation over reaction. Across this strange assembly of forms, there was coherence rather than chaos. Each body made sense within its setting. Together, they revealed a planet encouraging adaptation through patience, shaping life into configurations that could endure without excess. These animals did not anticipate the future. They embodied the present. Their unusual shapes, quietly recording the demands of a world that required solutions that modern life would never need to invent again. Water did not carve the land with permanence. Across much of the supercontinent, rivers existed as events rather than features, appearing suddenly, reshaping the ground, and then withdrawing without promise of return. Channels etched into the soil told stories of movement, but for much of the year they remained empty, silent paths waiting for the next release of rain. When water arrived, it arrived with force. Storms gathered moisture from distant regions and released it in concentrated bursts, sending floods racing across hardened terrain. Dry ground resisted absorption, allowing water to surge outward instead of sinking in. Rivers swelled rapidly, overtopping their banks, uprooting vegetation, and carrying sediment far downstream. These floods reshaped landscapes within days, leaving behind altered courses and fresh scars across the land. Yet this abundance never lingered. Once the rains passed, water retreated just as quickly. Floodplains dried, channels fractured into isolated pools. What had briefly been a connected system dissolved into fragments. The land returned to its dominant condition, dry, exposed, and demanding. Long stretches followed, with little or no surface water, erasing the sense of continuity that rivers usually provide. Life organized itself around this uncertainty. Animals learned the rhythms of appearance and disappearance, gathering near remaining pools and damp soils where moisture persisted longest. Movement became seasonal and deliberate, following the memory of water rather than fixed routes. Plants adapted by completing life cycles quickly or by surviving underground until conditions briefly improved. These temporary rivers created moments of intense productivity. Nutrients released by floods fueled rapid growth, drawing organisms into narrow corridors of abundance. For a short time, ecosystems flourished, layered with activity and interaction. Then, as water vanished, those same systems thinned or collapsed entirely. What had existed weeks before could disappear before the next season arrived. Some regions depended entirely on these fleeting waterways. Without permanent rivers to stabilize conditions, survival required flexibility within tight limits. Species that could tolerate both saturation and drought endured. Others existed only briefly, appearing during wet intervals and retreating or vanishing as dryness returned. The land did not allow gradual adjustment. It demanded readiness for extremes. The memory of water remained visible, even in its absence. Dry channels guided movement, offering slight depressions where cooler air gathered or moisture lingered beneath the surface. Animals followed these traces, not to flowing rivers, but to the possibility of relief. Each journey carried risk, as water could not be assumed, only hoped for. Over time, this pattern shaped entire regions. Ecosystems became transient, defined by pulses rather than steady flow. Stability depended on timing rather than location. The land supported life, but only in intervals, allowing abundance and scarcity to alternate with little warning. In these environments, continuity was fragile. A single missed flood could unravel generations of adaptation, leaving behind empty channels and silent ground where living systems had briefly taken hold. Forests still stood across large portions of the land, but their presence no longer guaranteed resilience. Many of these woodlands carried signs of quiet strain, visible not in dramatic loss, but in subtle thinning and slowed renewal. Trees remained rooted where they had grown for generations, yet the conditions that once supported their persistence were tightening around them. Heat pressed steadily through long seasons, drawing moisture from soil and leaves alike. Drought limited the ability of young plants to establish themselves beneath the canopy. Seeds that might once have taken hold after falling to the forest floor often failed to survive their first dry stretch. Regeneration became irregular, tied closely to rare favorable years rather than occurring reliably over time. Forests endured, but their future grew uncertain. When fire moved through these landscapes, it often did so with intensity. Dry conditions turned fallen branches and undergrowth into fuel that waited patiently for ignition. Fires reshaped large areas at once, consuming mature trees and altering the character of the soil beneath them. In wetter climates, forests could recover quickly after such events. Here, recovery stretched thin. Regrowth depended on timing, moisture, and luck, rather than predictable cycles. The structure of plant communities began to simplify. Species that required narrow conditions declined, replaced by those able to tolerate heat, drought, and poor soils. Diversity did not vanish entirely, but it narrowed, concentrating ecosystems around fewer dominant forms. With each loss, the forest shed a layer of redundancy, reducing its ability to absorb future stress without consequence. These changes affected every level of life connected to the canopy. Animals that depended on dense foliage for shelter or food found fewer suitable habitats. Shade grew patchy. Microclimates that once moderated temperature and moisture weakened. The forest floor became more exposed, allowing heat to penetrate deeper and moisture to evaporate more quickly. This reinforced the very conditions that limited regrowth. The forest's relationship with fire and drought became cyclical. Reduced diversity and canopy cover left landscapes more vulnerable to further burning. Each event reset progress rather than clearing space for renewal. Over time, forests occupied a delicate balance, present but no longer assured of continuity. Still, life adjusted within these constraints. Some plants invested heavily in survival strategies: thick bark, deep roots, slow growth. Others relied on producing large numbers of spores or seeds, waiting for rare moments of opportunity. These adaptations allowed forests to persist, but they did so at a cost to complexity and flexibility. Across the land, forests remained recognizable, yet their internal strength was fading. They functioned, sheltered life, and shaped local climates, but with diminishing tolerance for disturbance. Stability did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded quietly, year by year, as heat, drought, and fire reshaped woodlands into systems that endured through endurance alone. Far from forests and rivers, deep within the planet's crust, pressure continued to build. The land above showed little sign of what was unfolding below, yet vast regions were slowly being prepared for release. Cracks widened, magma gathered, and heat accumulated beneath the surface over long spans of time. This activity did not announce itself loudly. It progressed with patience, measured in thousands of quiet adjustments rather than singular events. When eruptions occurred, they were not always catastrophic in scale. Lava flowed, ash settled, and gases escaped into the air, often absorbed into the background rhythm of the planet. Carbon dioxide seeped upward, along with sulfur-rich compounds and other substances that altered the atmosphere in subtle ways. Each release was small enough to seem temporary, its immediate effects localized and brief. The land cooled, vegetation returned where it could, and life continued on familiar paths. Yet these eruptions did not stand alone. Over millions of years, their influence layered upon itself. Gas released into the atmosphere lingered longer than the ash that fell back to the ground. Carbon dioxide accumulated, trapping heat with increasing efficiency. Toxic compounds interacted with air and water, changing chemistry incrementally rather than suddenly. The planet absorbed these changes quietly, without spectacle. The atmosphere responded step by step. Concentrations shifted so gradually that no single generation of life would have detected a boundary crossing. Air remained breathable. Skies retained their familiar appearance. But the balance between gases moved steadily, altering how heat circulated and how climate systems behaved. Warmth lingered longer. Cooling took more time. Subtle feedbacks began reinforcing one another. Volcanic regions continued to grow. Some eruptions occurred far inland, others near coasts. But together, they contributed to a long-term pattern rather than isolated disruption. The effect resembled a slow turning of a dial rather than the striking of a bell. Each adjustment alone seemed manageable. Together, they reshaped the conditions under which ecosystems operated. Life adapted as it always had, responding to the world immediately in front of it. Plants adjusted growth rates, animals refined efficiency, forests and oceans absorbed what they could. No single eruption demanded retreat or reinvention. Instead, resilience was tested repeatedly, worn thinner by persistence rather than broken by force. This volcanic influence remained largely invisible in daily experience. Mountains did not always rise dramatically. Lava did not blanket entire continents at once. The true impact lay in accumulation, in the way repeated changes reduced margins already narrowed by heat, drought, and limited oxygen. The atmosphere became less forgiving, not hostile, but less generous than before. By the time these trends became deeply embedded, they no longer required active eruptions to maintain their influence. The gases already present continued shaping climate and chemistry on their own. What mattered most was not the violence of any single event, but the long arc they formed together. The planet changed not through shock, but through steady insistence, guided by forces that worked patiently beneath the surface. Heat no longer moved freely across the planet. With the land drawn together into a single immense mass, the familiar pathways that once carried warmth away were weakened. Oceans could no longer moderate the interior effectively, and winds lost the ability to distribute temperature evenly. Energy gathered where it arrived, lingering instead of dispersing, turning vast regions into reservoirs of sustained warmth. Across the heart of the supercontinent, this heat accumulated day after day. Sunlight struck exposed land and remained trapped, absorbed by rock and soil that released it slowly. Summer did not pass cleanly into cooler seasons. Warmth extended beyond its expected limits, stretching into months that offered little variation. The land baked steadily rather than violently, creating conditions defined by persistence rather than extremes. Nights, which once provided relief, grew less forgiving. Heat stored in the ground rose back into the air after sunset, softening the contrast between day and darkness. Temperatures dipped, but not enough to restore balance. Rest became shallow, both for ecosystems and for the organisms that depended on cooler intervals to recover. The world retained warmth like a held breath. At first, this environment seemed favorable to many forms of life. Cold-blooded animals benefited from extended warmth, able to remain active longer without expending energy to regulate internal temperature. Metabolism stayed efficient, movement required less effort. Growth proceeded steadily under conditions that reduced the cost of daily survival. For a time, heat appeared to be a quiet ally. Plants also responded, extending growing periods where moisture allowed. Chemical reactions accelerated. Development moved more quickly during warmer stretches. Life adjusted smoothly at the surface, integrating heat into its rhythms without immediate disruption. Over time, however, the balance shifted. Prolonged warmth increased evaporation, drawing moisture from soil and vegetation. Water cycles tightened, reducing the availability of a resource already under strain. Metabolic advantages began to carry costs, as sustained heat pushed bodies closer to physiological limits. Activity became harder to maintain without additional energy and water to support it. The environment stopped offering recovery. Without cooler intervals, stress accumulated in tissues and systems. Enzymes functioned near their optimal range without pause, leaving little buffer for change. Small increases in temperature carried outsized effects, narrowing the margin between efficiency and strain. What had once enhanced survival began to demand precision. Ecosystems reflected this shift. Species adapted to warmth found fewer opportunities to retreat or reset. Heat influenced behavior, restricting movement to narrow windows and shaded spaces. The landscape itself contributed to the problem, radiating stored energy back into the air long after the sun had moved on. This retained heat did not destroy life outright. It reshaped it, pressing organisms into narrower tolerances and reducing flexibility. Warmth remained present everywhere, but its character changed from supportive to insistent. The planet had not become hostile, yet it had become exacting. In holding on to heat for too long, Earth transformed a former advantage into a constant demand, one that life would have to meet without rest or relief. The deep ocean changed first, and it did so quietly. Far below the reach of sunlight, water that had once supported complex life began to lose its ability to sustain breath. Oxygen declined not in sudden absence, but in a steady narrowing of viable space. Layers that had long remained habitable slipped slowly beyond reach, turning familiar depths into places of strain. As circulation weakened, oxygen pore zones expanded outward and upward. These regions did not announce themselves with visible signs at the surface. They formed silently, spreading through mid and deep waters where renewal depended on slow mixing that no longer arrived on time. For organisms adapted to stable conditions, the change was immediate and unforgiving. Some retreated toward shallower layers where oxygen still circulated. Others failed to adjust and disappeared from regions they had occupied for millions of years. The deep sea, once a refuge of consistency, became increasingly fragmented. Life that depended on steady conditions found fewer pathways to survive. Movement through depth became restricted, as bands of water separated breathable zones from those that could no longer support complex organisms. The ocean did not lose life all at once. It lost continuity. Within these stagnant waters, chemistry began to shift. Decomposing material accumulated without sufficient oxygen to break it down cleanly. Toxic compounds built gradually, altering conditions further and reinforcing uninhabitability. These substances did not spread explosively. They lingered, pooled, and persisted, creating layers where survival was no longer possible for most forms of life. Food webs responded unevenly. Species higher in the water column continued familiar patterns for a time, supported by surface productivity that still appeared stable. Beneath them, however, the recycling systems that returned nutrients upward weakened. The loss of deep-sea organisms removed critical links, reducing the efficiency of energy transfer across layers. What remained functioned, but with fewer safeguards. The ocean's safety net depended on redundancy. When one region struggled, another could compensate. As oxygen pore zones expanded, that redundancy thinned. Fewer areas remained capable of absorbing stress without cascading effects. Each loss mattered more than the one before it, not because the change was sudden, but because capacity for recovery had diminished. Marine ecosystems adjusted where they could. Some species adapted to lower oxygen by slowing metabolism or altering behavior. Others shifted ranges, compressing into narrower bands of suitable water. Diversity remained visible, but it existed within tighter boundaries that left little room for error. This transformation altered the character of the ocean without changing its surface appearance. Waves continued their motion. Shorelines remained alive. Yet beneath, the sea was reorganizing itself around constraint. Breath became a limiting resource, shaping distribution and survival with increasing precision. The ocean continued to function, but its margin for disruption grew thinner, layer by layer, as silent zones expanded and the deep lost its former resilience. Feeding relationships tightened across land and sea as availability narrowed. What had once been a broad landscape of options became a sequence of smaller choices, each one shaped by timing, location, and tolerance. Energy still moved through ecosystems, but its pathways grew more precise, favoring organisms that could adjust their intake rather than those bound to a single source. Specialized feeders felt the change first. Animals and marine organisms adapted to particular plants, prey, or conditions found fewer opportunities to match their needs. A slight decline in one resource rippled outward, leaving these specialists with little room to shift behavior or diet. Their success depended on stability that no longer arrived reliably. As conditions fluctuated, even small interruptions proved difficult to overcome. Generalists endured longer. Those capable of consuming varied foods or switching strategies adapted more easily to change. Diets widened. Feeding behaviors became flexible. Survival depended less on excellence within one niche and more on tolerating imperfection across several. This flexibility did not make ecosystems stronger, but it kept them functioning under strain. As specialization declined, ecosystems simplified. Layers that once supported complexity thinned as certain interactions disappeared. Food webs shortened. The number of steps between primary producers and top consumers decreased, concentrating pressure on fewer connections. With each simplification, ecosystems lost depth, relying on fewer relationships to maintain balance. The absence of redundancy mattered most. Earlier systems could absorb loss because multiple species performed similar roles. When one declined, another could compensate. Now, fewer backups existed. Each species carried more weight within the system. A failure no longer remained isolated. It echoed outward, altering availability, behavior, and survival across multiple levels. This fragility developed gradually. No single moment marked a shift from abundance to scarcity. Instead, ecosystems adjusted continuously, trading resilience for efficiency. They functioned with precision rather than cushion. Productivity remained visible, but recovery slowed. When pressure eased briefly, systems regained little of what they had lost. The flow of energy became narrower. Seasonal abundance still occurred, but it traveled through constrained routes that left little margin for disruption. A missed bloom, a delayed rain, or a slight chemical imbalance could interrupt entire chains of consumption. The system did not require shock to falter. Persistence alone was enough. Over time, life organized itself around this narrowing structure. Populations fluctuated more sharply. Dominance shifted quickly when conditions favored one strategy over another. Stability appeared present, but it rested on fewer supports than before. The land and sea continued their cycles, feeding what they could and sustaining what fit within changing limits. Collapse did not arrive as an event. It remained a process, unfolding quietly as food chains lost flexibility and time replaced catastrophe as the defining force. At the far edges of the planet, cold no longer gathered in lasting forms. The poles did not rise into vast white caps or lock water into long stillness. Ice existed only briefly, if at all, forming and fading without persistence. This absence reshaped the planet quietly, altering how energy and water moved across Earth's surface. Without large ice caps to store water, the oceans behaved differently. Sea levels did not follow the familiar rhythm of advance and retreat tied to frozen reservoirs. Shorelines shifted gradually rather than cyclically, responding more to heat and regional conditions than to global freezing. Coastal environments adjusted to subtle changes in depth and salinity, not dramatic inundation. Marine habitats expanded and contracted unevenly, guided by temperature rather than ice. The lack of reflective ice altered how sunlight interacted with the planet. Darker land and open water absorbed more energy instead of sending it back into space. This feedback reinforced warmth, allowing heat to build more easily and persist longer. Cooling mechanisms that once depended on ice growth and melt no longer moderated the system. Temperature regulation relied on slower processes that struggled to counter sustained warmth. Atmospheric circulation adapted to this new balance. Air masses carried heat efficiently toward high latitudes, but with little cold to receive it, redistribution lost effectiveness. Winds and currents adjusted, but none offered relief comparable to the cooling once provided by ice. Seasonal contrasts softened in some regions, while deepening in others, creating unfamiliar climate patterns that favored neither stability nor recovery. Life responded gradually. Cold adapted niches contracted, not through sudden loss but through steady narrowing. Species that once relied on cooler conditions shifted ranges or adjusted behavior, finding less refuge at higher latitudes. At the same time, warmth-tolerant organisms expanded into areas previously limited by cold, reshaping ecosystems without announcing a clear boundary between old and new. The planet's internal feedback loops grew more complex. Heat encouraged evaporation, which influenced cloud formation, rainfall, and atmospheric chemistry. These interactions did not balance evenly. Some regions experienced intensified dryness, while others received increased precipitation. The absence of ice removed a stabilizing anchor, allowing small changes to carry larger consequences across interconnected systems. This world operated with fewer breaks. Once warmth accumulated, little slowed its persistence. Cooling occurred, but it required extended periods and precise conditions to take hold. Heat lingered across land and sea, shaping daily conditions and long-term trends alike. The planet did not overheat suddenly. It remained warm consistently, demanding continuous adjustment from life. In this ice-free balance, Earth still functioned as a living system. Oceans circulated, winds moved, and ecosystems adapted. Yet the loss of frozen extremes narrowed the range of responses available to the planet itself. With fewer cooling mechanisms in place, Earth held onto warmth longer than before, carrying that energy forward season after season, quietly redefining what stability meant in a world without ice to temper its breath. Movement once offered possibility. In earlier ages, life could respond to pressure by shifting outward, following coastlines, climbing latitude, or crossing land bridges into gentler conditions. In this world, Those pathways had narrowed almost to nothing. The shape of the planet itself limited escape, compressing life into a shared space where distance no longer promised relief. With all major land joined together, there were no distant continents carrying different climates or untouched ecosystems. The supercontinent stretched so broadly that interior stress touched nearly every direction at once. Heat, drought, and unstable seasons formed continuous zones rather than isolated pockets. Traveling farther often meant moving deeper into the same challenges instead of away from them. The obstacles that mattered most were not walls of stone or rising seas, but conditions that followed life wherever it went. Air grew thinner with oxygen across regions. Water became unpredictable over wide distances. Temperature extremes repeated across latitudes. Even when land remained open, the environment itself restricted passage, filtering movement through tolerance rather than geography. Animals attempted migration where possible, shifting ranges gradually along familiar corridors. These journeys required energy and water already in short supply. For many species, movement increased risk rather than reducing it. Crossing exposed terrain during dry periods or prolonged heat placed bodies under stress that could not be recovered easily. Routes narrowed until only the most adaptable could use them at all. Plants faced even tighter limits. Rooted in place, they depended entirely on local conditions. When temperature or moisture drifted beyond tolerance, relocation was impossible. Survival depended on persistence, slow adjustment, or decline. As climates shifted unevenly, plant communities thinned in some areas and stabilized narrowly in others, reinforcing constraints on animals that relied on them. The planet's unified climate system reduced contrasts that once allowed refuge. Mountain ranges offered some variation, coastlines some moderation, but these were exceptions rather than solutions. Large-scale relief no longer existed. Environmental pressure spread broadly, leaving few untouched margins where stress systems could reset. Adaptation became the primary path forward. Bodies adjusted shape, metabolism, and behavior within tight boundaries. Life cycles shifted timing. Growth slowed. Reproduction became cautious. Evolution continued, but under conditions that favored fine-tuning over exploration. Every change carried cost, and experimentation narrowed as margins disappeared. Some species endured by becoming highly efficient, surviving where others could not. Others persisted only in fragmented pockets, isolated not by distance but by suitability. When local conditions crossed a threshold, there was often nowhere left to retreat. Losses accumulated quietly, unnoticed beyond the immediate landscape. This confinement altered the rhythm of life. Across the planet, survival was no longer aided by movement toward better places. It depended on enduring where one already stood. Many species succeeded for long stretches within this framework, holding ground through adaptation alone, yet the absence of escape carried a hidden weight. With no distant refuge to soften change, every shift mattered more, and every tolerance carried the burden of being final. Along the shallow margins of the seas, structures that had taken ages to assemble were losing their grip on permanence. Reefs still traced coastlines and continental shelves, but their growth had slowed and in some regions halted entirely. What remained carried the shape of endurance without its former momentum, holding together through persistence rather than renewal. Reef-building organisms depended on narrow conditions that no longer arrived reliably. Small shifts in temperature altered the chemistry of surrounding water, interfering with the slow construction of mineral skeletons. Changes that once fell within tolerable ranges now lingered too long or returned too often. Growth weakened first, then reproduction, then survival itself. The decline unfolded quietly, layer by layer, without a single moment that signaled loss. As reefs weakened, their role as anchors of marine life diminished. These structures had served as gathering points where food, shelter, and complexity intersected. When they faltered, the web of relationships they supported loosened. Fish species that relied on tight reef spaces for breeding or protection found fewer stable places to persist. Invertebrates declined where shelter thinned. The reef did not vanish at once, but its ability to support abundance narrowed steadily. Temperature sensitivity compounded the strain. Warm periods lasted longer, reducing recovery time between stresses. Chemical balance shifted as ocean composition changed, affecting organisms that required precision to maintain their structures. Even slight alterations mattered. Reefs responded slowly to improvement and quickly to disruption, making stability difficult to sustain in a changing sea. As reef systems contracted, marine biodiversity followed. The loss was gradual, expressed as absence rather than catastrophe. Species became less evenly distributed. Some retreated to remaining pockets where conditions remained tolerable. Others disappeared from entire regions, leaving gaps that were not easily filled. Diversity did not collapse outright. It thinned, reducing the variety of roles available within the ecosystem. This thinning weakened the ocean as a whole. Reefs had absorbed disturbance by providing alternative pathways for energy flow and shelter during periods of stress. Without them functioning fully, marine systems lost an important layer of resilience. Shocks that once dissipated across complex networks now traveled farther, affecting species beyond the reef itself. The decline reshaped food relationships near the surface. Juvenile fish faced higher predation without dense structures for protection. Grazers altered behavior as algae and microorganisms spread differently across weakened reefs. Changes echoed outward, influencing nearby seafloor communities and open waters alike. Despite these shifts, the ocean remained active and alive. Reefs persisted in form even as function eroded. Their presence masked vulnerability, offering familiar outlines without former strength. Over time, this quiet loss accumulated, reducing the sea's capacity to buffer change. With reefs already fading, the ocean carried fewer safeguards into an uncertain future, becoming a system that could still endure pressure, but recover from it with increasing difficulty. Time did most of the work, not through sudden shifts or visible breaks, but through repetition so steady it blended into the background of life itself. Conditions did not arrive and depart, they stayed. Season after season, generation after generation, the planet asked the same questions of the organisms living upon it, offering little variation in its demands. Millions of years passed under this persistent pressure. Each generation inherited a world slightly more restrictive than the one before it, though the difference was often too small to notice within a single lifetime. Heat lingered, water remained uncertain, oxygen offered less support. Ecosystems continued to function, but always closer to their limits than they had been in the distant past. Stress accumulated quietly. It did not appear as crisis, but as constraint. Growth slowed incrementally. Reproductive success narrowed. Juveniles required more favorable timing to survive. Small advantages mattered more than they once had, while small disadvantages carried heavier consequences. What had once been optional traits became necessary just to persist. Evolution responded, but at its own pace. Change occurred across long spans, shaped by selection that favored efficiency, tolerance, and restraint. Yet the environment did not wait. Conditions shifted steadily, sometimes outpacing the ability of species to adjust fully. This imbalance did not demand catastrophe, it simply required persistence. Survival margins thinned gradually. Species could still endure hardship, but recovery became harder after each challenge. Populations rebounded more slowly. Diversity returned less completely after disruption. The buffer that once separated survival from failure grew narrower with each passing era. Life adapted by holding on rather than expanding. Innovation slowed. Proven forms persisted, while experimentation carried greater risk. Lineages that had thrived for tens of millions of years continued, but with less flexibility than before. The planet still supported complexity, yet that complexity relied on fewer tolerances and fewer alternatives. No single generation experienced the full weight of this change. Each lived within a world that still seemed workable. Food could be found, water appeared eventually, reproduction continued. The difference lay in how much effort these processes required and how little room remained for error. Stability persisted, but it became increasingly precise. Nothing dramatic was necessary for this transformation to matter. No singular failure marked the shift. Time itself served as the force of change, pressing gently but continuously. The planet did not need to strike life with sudden blows. It simply maintained conditions long enough for limits to reveal themselves. By the end of this long interval, Earth remained alive and active, shaped by countless small adjustments layered one upon another. Systems still functioned, but they did so under accumulated weight. The passage of time had quietly reduced tolerance, leaving life balanced within margins, shaped not by a moment, but by millions of years of unrelenting consistency. At a glance, the world still seemed full. Across land and sea, life occupied familiar spaces, filling forests, coastlines, and open waters with movement and sound. Populations remained visible. Interactions continued. To any single moment in time, the planet appeared to be functioning much as it always had, carrying abundance forward without obvious interruption. Many species persisted successfully within this arrangement. Generations followed one another with apparent continuity. Predators hunted, herbivores fed. Reproduction occurred often enough to sustain numbers. The rhythms of daily survival continued, reinforced by habits shaped over millions of years. From the outside, there was little to suggest fragility. Yet beneath this surface, resilience had thinned. Systems that once relied on multiple layers of support now rested on fewer connections. Where diversity had once buffered change, efficiency replaced redundancy. Food webs still operated, but with fewer alternative paths for energy to travel. When one link weakened, there were fewer others ready to compensate. Stability became precise rather than flexible. Conditions had to remain within narrower ranges for systems to function smoothly. Temperature, moisture, chemistry, and timing all mattered more than they once had. Slight deviations carried greater influence, not because life had become weaker, but because the room to absorb variation had diminished. Ecosystems still corrected themselves after disturbance, but recovery took longer and achieved less. Populations returned closer to minimum thresholds. Diversity rebounded unevenly. Each cycle ended with a little less complexity than before, though the change was gradual enough to escape notice in the short term. This illusion of stability was reinforced by continuity. Life did not collapse or retreat visibly. It simply rearranged itself repeatedly within tightening limits. Success became dependent on alignment rather than adaptability. Species that fit current conditions endured. Those that relied on broader tolerances declined quietly. The planet itself contributed to this impression. Landscapes retained familiar outlines. Oceans still moved in long patterns. Forests remained standing. These enduring shapes suggested permanence, masking the subtle erosion of internal support. Stability appeared intact because its external form persisted. Over time, the cost of imbalance increased. Small disruptions no longer faded without trace. Their effects lingered, interacting with existing strain. What once would have been absorbed by the system now left marks that compounded slowly. The margins separating order from breakdown narrowed, measured not in moments, but in tolerance. This narrowing did not announce itself with drama. It unfolded without warning signs that could be easily recognized. Life continued, thriving in some places, persisting in others. The difference lay in how much strain could be endured before recovery became incomplete. By this stage, the world rested on fewer supports than it once had. Stability was real, but it was delicate. It depended on consistency more than resilience, precision more than strength. The illusion held because nothing had failed outright. Yet beneath it, the margin for error was quietly shrinking, shaped by time, accumulation, and the slow fading of flexibility that once made abundance secure. Change no longer passed without consequence. Disturbances that once faded into the background now left impressions that remained, altering the shape of ecosystems long after the initial cause had settled. A slight shift in climate, a brief absence of water, or a temporary loss of a species carried weight disproportionate to its size. The planet had entered a phase where recovery demanded more than time alone. Ecosystems still attempted to restore balance, but their efforts met resistance. Regrowth occurred unevenly, filling some gaps while leaving others unresolved. When a species declined, its role did not always return. Food chains adjusted around absence rather than replacement, forming new arrangements that functioned, but with less richness than before. The system adapted by simplifying, not by rebuilding what had been lost. These changes accumulated quietly. A forest that failed to regenerate after drought did not regain its former diversity. A reef that lost key organisms continued without them, reshaping the surrounding community. Each loss reduced the number of interactions available to buffer future stress. What remained worked harder to maintain stability, bearing responsibility once shared across many connections. As complexity declined, fragility increased. Systems composed of fewer parts could not absorb fluctuation as easily. Variation that once enriched ecosystems now tested their limits. Recovery pathways narrowed until only the most immediate responses remained viable. The deeper layers of resilience, those that relied on redundancy and diversity, had already eroded. Time no longer healed everything. Some transitions crossed thresholds that could not be reversed under existing conditions. Soil composition shifted beyond what favored certain plants. Water chemistry stabilized in ranges that excluded former inhabitants. Populations adjusted downward and remained there, sustained but reduced. The system settled into new states that persisted because returning to previous ones required conditions that no longer existed. Life adapted to this permanence by refining what survived. Energy flowed along fewer routes. Behavior became conservative. Growth slowed further. Innovation carried greater risk, and most lineages favored maintenance over expansion. Evolution continued its careful work, but the environment offered less room for experimentation. The appearance of function remained. Ecosystems still operated, producing biomass and sustaining populations. Yet each operated closer to minimum thresholds. The absence of recovery capacity meant that balance depended on continued stability, not on the ability to respond dynamically. When stability wavered, adjustment carried lasting cost. This was not a moment of collapse. It was a transition into a state where loss mattered more than gain. Systems became easier to disrupt and harder to restore. The fabric of life thinned gradually, thread by thread, without tearing all at once. By this stage, recovery was no longer guaranteed. The planet still supported life, but it did so with increasing care, balancing function on structures that could no longer rebuild themselves fully. Fragility became an enduring condition, shaped by accumulation rather than catastrophe, marking a world that had learned how to persist, but had lost much of its ability to begin again. Variation once moved freely through life's fabric, testing shapes, strategies, and behaviors across long spans of time. In this world, that freedom narrowed. Evolution continued its quiet work, but the range of possibilities it explored became smaller, guided less by opportunity and more by constraint. Environments under constant stress rewarded reliability over novelty. Forms that already fit within tight limits persisted, while those that pushed boundaries struggled to establish themselves. New traits still appeared, but fewer survived long enough to spread. Innovation slowed not because life lost its capacity for change, but because conditions punished risk with increasing consistency. The pressure acted subtly, a new body plan that required extra energy, faster growth, or greater sensitivity to temperature often failed before it could stabilize. A different feeding strategy that depended on abundance found little support in narrowed food webs. Small advantages no longer accumulated easily. Selection favored traits that reduced demand rather than expanded ability. As a result, successful designs became conservative. Body plans repeated familiar patterns. Behaviors emphasized efficiency, patience, and restraint. Evolution refined what already worked instead of branching outward. Lineages persisted by polishing existing solutions rather than inventing new ones. This shift altered the trajectory of diversity. Species counts did not collapse, but expansion slowed and then stalled. The appearance of entirely new ecological roles became rare. Ecosystems filled with variations on established themes, adjusting internally while remaining outwardly similar across long spans of time. Diversity held steady rather than growing, shaped by repetition rather than exploration. The planet supported this stability by offering consistency without generosity. Conditions remained survivable, but rarely forgiving. Populations that aligned with these limits endured. Those that deviated faced immediate pressure to return or disappear. Over generations, this filtered life into narrower channels where experimentation carried greater cost. Even genetic change responded to this environment. Variation persisted within populations, but extremes were trimmed quickly. Traits that produced marginal gains at high expense were selected against. The result was a steady refinement of moderation, producing organisms finely tuned to specific conditions, but less adaptable beyond them. This narrowing did not erase life's complexity. Instead, it reorganized it around endurance. Systems functioned smoothly within their bounds, cycling energy with precision. Yet beneath that order lay a quiet rigidity, the capacity to shift into new forms or occupy new spaces diminished as stability demanded fidelity to what already existed. Life did not stop evolving. It learned to conserve its own potential. Change occurred in small increments, careful and reversible when possible. The planet ran fewer experiments not out of exhaustion, but out of necessity. Survival required holding ground rather than seeking novelty. Across land and sea, this restraint shaped the living world into a place of persistence rather than possibility. Diversity remained present, but it no longer expanded its reach. Life continued its long story, not by exploring new paths, but by maintaining balance within shrinking margins, adapting to endure rather than to discover. Chemistry shifted without spectacle. There were no colors to mark the change, no sudden clouds or altered horizons. The transformation unfolded at scales too small for casual notice, moving through molecules and reactions that governed the planet's deeper balance. Yet these quiet adjustments carried weight far beyond their subtle appearance. Carbon no longer followed its familiar rhythm. The exchange between atmosphere, ocean, rock, and living tissue drifted out of alignment. Carbon entered the system steadily, but its removal slowed, lingering longer in air and water. This altered how heat was retained and how energy moved through ecosystems. The planet continued to breathe, but its breath became uneven. At the same time, oxygen followed a separate path. Production and consumption no longer matched as closely as before. Photosynthetic life still released oxygen, but the processes that consumed it intensified or shifted location. Decomposition, chemical reactions, and respiration drew oxygen away faster in certain environments, especially within warming waters and stagnant zones. The balance that once kept oxygen plentiful grew less predictable. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in the oceans. Water chemistry adjusted gradually as dissolved gases and minerals responded to changing conditions. Acidity increased in some regions, altering how organisms built shells and skeletons. Nutrient ratios shifted, influencing which forms of life could thrive. These were not abrupt changes. They crossed thresholds quietly, slipping from stable to strained without a clear dividing line. Such thresholds mattered precisely because they were subtle. Marine organisms adapted to narrow chemical ranges found their tolerances tested. Growth slowed, development faltered. Reproduction became less reliable. Each adjustment reduced resilience, narrowing the window in which life could function normally. The sea remained full, yet its internal workings grew less forgiving. On land, chemistry also played a role. Soils responded to prolonged warmth and altered atmospheric composition. Nutrients circulated differently, affecting plant growth and decay. Microbial communities shifted, changing how elements moved between living and non-living systems. These transformations were measured in percentages and reactions, not invisible landmarks. Because these changes were invisible, they accumulated without resistance. Life responded only after effects became unavoidable. By then, reversing course required conditions that no longer existed. Chemistry did not offer warning signs, it imposed consequences. The interaction between carbon and oxygen shaped nearly every process on the planet. Metabolism, growth, climate regulation, and energy flow all depended on their balance. As that balance drifted, systems adapted by tightening tolerances. Survival depended increasingly on precise alignment with chemical conditions that continued to shift. This created a feedback loop. Altered chemistry stressed ecosystems, which reduced biological buffering, allowing chemical changes to accelerate further. Each step reinforced the next, not through dramatic escalation, but through persistence. The system moved forward because nothing interrupted it. The planet still looked familiar. Seas reflected light. Forests stood. Air remained breathable. Yet beneath these surfaces, chemistry was rewriting the rules of survival. The changes could not be seen, but they reshaped what life could endure. In this quiet imbalance, devastation did not arrive as an event. It arrived as an outcome, produced patiently by reactions that never asked for attention, only time. Bodies began to reflect restraint. Across land and sea, the largest forms that once moved with relative ease became rarer, not through sudden disappearance, but through gradual absence. Maximum sizes drifted downward as maintaining mass demanded more energy than the environment could reliably supply. Size, once an advantage, carried increasing cost. Growth slowed across many lineages. Juveniles remained smaller for longer periods, extending the time required to reach maturity. This was not a failure of development, but an adjustment to limited resources and narrower margins. Energy was distributed carefully, prioritized toward survival rather than rapid expansion. The pace of life lengthened, unfolding with measured patience rather than urgency. Slower growth carried consequence. Extended developmental periods increased vulnerability, exposing young animals to prolonged risk before reproduction became possible. Survival depended on timing, alignment with favorable seasons, and careful use of energy. Many individuals reached maturity, but fewer could afford mistakes along the way. Growth became an investment rather than a given. Reproduction itself grew more uncertain. Producing offspring required reserves that were not always available. Breeding seasons narrowed. Fewer young were produced, and each represented greater biological commitment. Success depended on conditions aligning precisely. A missed window could echo across years, leaving gaps in population structure that took long periods to repair. Parental strategies reflected this caution. Care increased where possible, protection extended where energy allowed. In some species, reproductive frequency declined in exchange for higher survival of fewer offspring. These changes did not weaken populations outright, but they reduced flexibility, making recovery from loss slower and less complete. In this environment, dominance lost much of its meaning. Traits that once favored strength, aggression, or rapid pursuit offered limited benefit when energy budgets tightened. Winning a confrontation demanded resources that were difficult to replace. Efficiency replaced power as the primary measure of success. Anatomy adjusted accordingly. Bodies grew compact. Muscle favored endurance over force. Movement became deliberate, conserving energy rather than expending it freely. Feeding behaviors optimized effort, minimizing waste. Even sensory investment shifted, favoring detection and timing instead of sustained pursuit. Predatory roles did not vanish, but they transformed. Strategies emphasized patience, ambush, and familiarity with terrain. Prey species benefited from the same efficiency, reducing exposure and limiting unnecessary movement. The balance between hunter and hunted remained, but it operated within narrower energetic bounds. These pressures reshaped entire communities. Population densities adjusted downward without collapsing. Interactions became less frequent but more consequential. Each success or failure mattered more than before, not because life had become fragile, but because tolerance had narrowed. Animals continued to thrive within these limits. The land and sea remained populated, active, and varied, yet the rules had shifted. Survival belonged to those that demanded less from their surroundings while extracting what they needed with precision. The era no longer rewarded dominance or excess. It favored moderation, conservation, and alignment with a world that offered less room for expansion. In this quiet recalibration, life persisted not by exceeding limits, but by living exactly within them, shaped by an environment that measured success not in size or strength, but in careful balance. The planet continued to move. Winds still crossed continents. Oceans still rose and fell. Life remained present in every environment where it had taken hold. There was no emptiness, no silence, no sign of abandonment. Earth was alive, active, and occupied, yet its motion carried a different quality than before, slower and more deliberate, shaped by the effort of persistence. Across ecosystems, activity continued within narrow bounds. Forests produced new growth, though not as freely. Oceans sustained food webs, though with fewer layers. Animals fed, reproduced, and endured, but often with reduced numbers and tighter timing. These systems had not failed, but they worked harder to achieve what once came easily. Energy moved through the planet with less excess. The flow between sun, atmosphere, water, and life became precise, leaving little margin for waste. Each transfer mattered. Each inefficiency carried consequence. Stability depended on delicate alignment between processes that had grown sensitive to even small shifts. This strain showed itself not in collapse, but in effort. Recovery followed disturbance, but with restraint. Growth returned, but not fully. Losses accumulated slowly, becoming part of the background rather than events that demanded attention. The world adjusted continuously, accommodating stress rather than resolving it. Life responded with discipline. Organisms limited behavior, conserved resources, and avoided unnecessary risk. Systems that once absorbed variation now required consistency to persist. The planet still supported complexity, yet that complexity leaned heavily on balance rather than resilience. These conditions produced a form of endurance that carried cost. Ecosystems functioned without flexibility, maintaining themselves through constant fine-tuning. Minor disruptions could no longer be ignored. Each required adjustment, drawing from reserves that were not easily replaced. The system did not break, but it tightened. The appearance of continuity reinforced the illusion of strength. Landscapes retained familiar outlines. Species interactions continued. The rhythm of seasons remained recognizable. Yet beneath this familiarity, tolerance had narrowed to a thin band. The distance between functioning and failure shortened, measured not in dramatic steps, but in incremental shifts. Earth carried this strain evenly. It did not isolate stress to one region or one system. Heat, chemistry, biology, and circulation all contributed, layering pressure across the planet. No single factor dominated. Instead, their combined persistence shaped a world that could still sustain life, but without generosity. In this state, the planet did not seek recovery. It sought balance. Each system learned to operate exactly within its limits, neither exceeding nor retreating. This precision allowed survival, but it removed capacity for surprise or resilience. There was little room left to absorb the unexpected. Earth remained alive, not through abundance, but through restraint. It carried the weight of its own history, shaped by millions of years of gradual tightening. Life continued its long presence, aware only through adaptation that conditions had changed. The planet endured, steady and strained, maintaining equilibrium not because it was strong, but because it had learned how to function with almost nothing left to give. The final stretch of this long age passed without spectacle. Days followed seasons, and seasons folded into years, with no clear signal that anything fundamental had shifted. The world still moved within familiar bounds, carrying life forward through patterns that felt established and dependable. There was no single warning that rose above the rest, no sudden silence in the forests, no universal die-off in the seas, no unmistakable signal that could be traced across every system at once. Instead, the planet carried forward the accumulated weight of countless small changes, each one modest on its own, each one quietly reducing the space left for adjustment. Change arrived through persistence rather than force. Heat lingered a little longer. Oxygen supported a little less activity. Water returned less reliably. Chemistry leaned slightly away from balance. None of these shifts demanded immediate response. Life adapted where it could, reshaping behavior and form in subtle ways that allowed continuity to continue. Because the process was gradual, it remained largely unnoticed. Species responded to immediate conditions, not to trends unfolding over millions of years. A population adjusted to a dry season. Another adapted to thinner oxygen. A reef endured warmer water. Each response succeeded locally, reinforcing the sense that stability remained intact. The planet offered no announcement. Landscapes retained familiar outlines. Oceans still carried currents. Forests still stood where they had long grown. The rhythms of survival continued uninterrupted, giving no reason to suspect that thresholds had already been crossed. By this point, systems operated with precision rather than excess. They functioned because conditions remained within narrow ranges that still supported life. The cost of this precision was invisibility. There were no dramatic failures to draw attention. The danger lay in how little room remained to absorb anything new. Life moved forward without anticipation. Animals followed instincts shaped by the past. Plants responded to the present soil and air. Microorganisms carried out reactions dictated by immediate chemistry. None could sense how close the system had come to its limits. There was no mechanism to recognize accumulation as threat. The planet itself did not signal transition. It did not pause or change direction. It simply continued along a path shaped by long-term pressure and diminishing tolerance. The calm that persisted was real, but it was not protective. It existed because collapse does not require noise to begin. By the time this era reached its end, the edge had already been crossed. Not through a single step, but through many small movements that together led life beyond the margin it had unknowingly relied upon. Stability remained visible, even as resilience faded. The ground still felt solid, even as support thinned beneath it. Nothing dramatic was required for what followed. The conditions were already in place. The systems were already strained. The calm did not mark safety. It marked completion. The planet stood balanced on outcomes shaped long before, carrying life forward to a point where the next change would no longer be absorbed, only felt. Significance does not always announce itself through drama. Some moments matter because of what they quietly prepare, not because of what they immediately reveal. This point in Earth's history carried that kind of weight, shaped not by a single failure, but by the way countless systems had been brought to their limits at the same time. By this stage, the planet was carrying more strain than at any other known interval. Heat, chemistry, biology, and circulation were all operating within narrowed tolerances. Life persisted across land and sea, but almost every system that supported it had lost flexibility. Earlier challenges had tested individual components. Here, the entire framework was under pressure simultaneously. What made this moment distinctive was not the presence of stress alone, but its distribution. There were no broad refuges untouched by difficulty. Oceans were altered at depth and at the surface. Land climates were constrained across vast distances. Atmosphere, chemistry, and biology were no longer misaligned in isolated ways. They were interacting, reinforcing one another, and amplifying limits already reached. Compared to later losses in Earth's story, this period carried a deeper vulnerability. Some later events unfolded rapidly, overwhelming otherwise resilient systems. Here, resilience itself had already been worn thin. The planet did not require an extraordinary disturbance to be pushed further. Ordinary pressures, sustained over time, had accomplished much of the work. This is why the setup mattered more than anything that followed. The environment had already shaped outcomes by narrowing what life could tolerate. When options disappear slowly, fate becomes constrained long before it is sealed. Choices vanish quietly, pathways close without notice. By the time change accelerates, flexibility is gone. Earth systems respond to conditions long before consequences become visible. Temperature alters chemistry. Chemistry reshapes biology. Biology feeds back into climate. These interactions do not wait for catastrophe. They operate continuously, adjusting balance with each passing generation. In this moment, those adjustments had carried the planet into a state where even small changes could not be absorbed. Disaster is often imagined as an external force arriving suddenly. Here, the defining force was duration. Stress persisted long enough to transform structure. Life adapted, but adaptation itself became constrained by the same pressures it responded to. Survival strategies grew precise and narrow. Systems continued to function, but only within exact limits. This period stands apart because it demonstrates how environments shape destiny long before any collapse becomes obvious. The future was influenced not by the size of an eventual disturbance, but by the condition of the world that received it. A robust system can absorb shock. A strained one cannot, even when the shock is modest. Earth did not fail at this moment. It reached a condition, a state in which history would be determined by what had already accumulated rather than by what might arrive next. The planet had done most of the deciding in advance through patience, pressure, and time. What followed would matter deeply, but it would matter because the groundwork had been laid quietly, long before anything appeared to change. Change did not arrive as a rupture, it emerged as a continuation, a shift in emphasis rather than direction. The world that followed grew out of what already existed, shaped by conditions that had been tightening for millions of years. Earth did not suddenly become unfamiliar. It carried forward the same continents, the same oceans, the same sky, but under rules that no longer allowed easy balance. The transformation ahead was profound precisely because it built upon what had been prepared. Systems already operating at their limits were asked to function under additional strain. What followed was not an interruption of history, but an escalation of pressures that had been quietly accumulating. The planet moved forward with momentum it could not easily redirect. Life entered this new phase without warning or preparation. Species continued patterns refined by long adaptation to stress, unaware that those strategies would soon be tested beyond any previous boundary. Survival had already become narrow and precise. There was little capacity left to adjust further. What had once been sufficient would soon prove inadequate. The environment began to shift more decisively, but only because it had been freed from restraint. Feedbacks that once dampened change now reinforced it. Heat lingered longer. Chemistry drifted faster. Circulation weakened further. Each change amplified the next, not through novelty, but through release from stability that no longer existed. This was not a moment defined by novelty of threat. Volcanism, warming, chemical imbalance, and biological stress had all existed before. What made the world that followed different was their convergence within an already strained system. Stress stacked upon stress until ordinary disturbances carried extraordinary weight. Life responded as it always had, through persistence rather than prediction. Populations fluctuated, ranges shifted where possible, behaviors adjusted within limited bounds. Some lineages held on briefly through resilience accumulated over deep time. Others faltered quickly, unable to meet demands that exceeded their remaining tolerance. The planet did not choose outcomes, it followed processes. The groundwork laid by prolonged imbalance now shaped every consequence. When conditions accelerated, there was no buffer left to soften the transition. The system moved forward because it could not do otherwise. This phase of Earth's history stands as a reminder that transformation is rarely sudden in origin, even when its effects appear dramatic. What followed was built patiently by earlier states, shaped by time more than force. The testing of life ahead would be severe, but it would not be arbitrary. It would reflect the limits that had already been reached. Earth would not remain as it was, but it did not abandon continuity. The same planet carried forward, altered by the weight of its own history. What emerged next was not disconnected from the long calm that preceded it. It was made possible by it. In this way, the world that followed was neither surprise nor accident. It was the natural extension of a planet that had learned how to function under constraint, and then was asked to do more than constraint could allow. The transformation approached not as an event breaking the past, but as the past finally expressing its full consequence. Survival did not begin at the moment of collapse. It began earlier, quietly, woven into choices and traits that carried no awareness of what lay ahead. Long before conditions crossed their final thresholds, some lineages were already drifting into forms better suited to endurance under pressure, not because they anticipated crisis, but because they lived well within constraint. These organisms shared no single shape or habitat. They appeared across land and sea, in soil, water, and forest shade. What connected them was not dominance or specialization, but flexibility. They tolerated variation. They survived irregular conditions. Their lives unfolded without demanding precise alignment of resources. Strength offered little advantage here. Large size, rapid growth, or narrow optimization carried costs that became harder to pay. Instead, survival favored organisms that could adjust behavior, diet, or timing without collapse. Those that endured fluctuations as part of ordinary existence gained quiet resilience. Small advantages mattered: a slower metabolism, a broader diet, the ability to wait rather than move, the capacity to persist through poor seasons without growth. None of these traits guaranteed success on their own, but together they shaped lineages that lost less ground when conditions worsened. These advantages accumulated without recognition. Evolution did not accelerate or shift direction sharply. It continued through ordinary selection, allowing marginally better fits to persist and multiply. Over many generations, these slight differences compounded, separating those who merely survived from those who could persist when margins disappeared. Some lineages endured stress not by resisting change, but by absorbing it. They occupied niches that fluctuated naturally, living with uncertainty rather than stability. For them, narrow tolerances were never an option. Their existence already required adaptation to variable oxygen, moisture, or temperature. When the broader world grew unstable, their strategies were already in place. Survival, in this sense, was not heroic. It was quiet. It did not involve competition won or territory gained. It unfolded through persistence across long spans of ordinary hardship. The organisms best prepared for what followed were not those at the peak of complexity, but those accustomed to limitation. This preparation did not ensure immunity. Many resilient forms would still be tested severely, but they carried something others lacked: room to adjust. Their biology permitted change without immediate failure. Where others required precise conditions, these lineages tolerated approximation. By the time crisis truly arrived, selection had already done much of its work, not through foresight, but through patience. Survival had been quietly rehearsed over millions of years, embedded in traits shaped by long exposure to constraint. In this way, the future was seeded well before it unfolded. The lineages that would persist were not chosen in a moment of collapse. They were shaped gradually, molded by pressures that narrowed possibilities long before outcomes became visible. Survival began without ceremony. It took root in flexibility, in moderation, in the ability to continue when conditions shifted beyond comfort. Long before survival meant anything at all, it was already underway, waiting for a world that would finally demand what only quiet endurance could provide. This part of Earth's story was never driven by characters or single events. There were no villains, no dramatic turning points that carried intent or purpose. What unfolded instead was the behavior of a system, complex, interconnected, and indifferent. Change emerged not from conflict, but from interaction. Every part of the planet responded to every other part. Climate shaped chemistry, chemistry guided biology, biology altered atmosphere and soil. Each response fed back into the system that created it, not as a conscious act, but as a consequence of physical law. Nothing needed to go wrong for the system to move. It only needed to continue. Feedback loops governed the pace. When heat increased, chemical reactions shifted. When chemistry shifted, biological processes adjusted. Those adjustments altered how carbon and oxygen moved through land and sea, which influenced temperature again. Each loop reinforced the next, quietly tightening the overall balance. The planet did not accelerate change deliberately. It followed pathways already available. This interaction gave Earth its power and its vulnerability. Stability existed when feedbacks balanced one another. Change emerged when balance drifted. The same mechanisms that once kept conditions favorable slowly became the drivers of constraint, not because they failed, but because they responded exactly as designed to evolving circumstances. Biology played its role without awareness. Organisms altered their surroundings simply by living, breathing, growing, and decaying. Over long spans of time, these effects accumulated. Forests influenced air, microbes reshaped soil, and ocean chemistry, marine life, governed nutrient flow. Life was not separate from the system, it was part of the machinery. Climate did not act as a background. It interacted continuously with life and chemistry, responding to shifts in circulation, atmospheric composition, and surface conditions. Small changes persisted long enough to reshape averages. Once reshaped, those averages guided what life could tolerate next. None of these interactions carried intent. Earth did not aim toward collapse or renewal. It followed constraints set by physics, chemistry, and energy flow. When conditions moved beyond certain bounds, the system responded. When feedbacks reinforced one another, momentum increased. The planet did not judge outcomes, it expressed them. Seeing Earth as a system clarifies why warning signs were subtle and transitions gradual. Systems rarely announce thresholds. They pass them quietly, continuing to function until responses change character. Stability gives way not through drama, but through accumulation. This perspective also dissolves the idea of blame. There was no single cause to isolate, no moment to point toward as the start. Every process participated, every interaction mattered. The outcome was not a failure, but a consequence. Earth changes because it cannot do otherwise. Energy moves, matter cycles, life responds. These forces do not pause to consider comfort or continuity. They interact, adjusting balance moment by moment across vast scales of time. In this story, the planet is neither hero nor victim. It is a system unfolding according to its nature. What happened here reflects that truth. Earth did not choose transformation. It arrived there through feedbacks patiently at work, reminding us that planetary change does not require intent, only time and connection. 250 million years ago, Earth carried a shape that would still be recognizable today. Continents rose above the oceans, water moved in steady rhythms, land stretched wide beneath the sky. From a distance, the planet appeared complete, balanced, and alive with motion. Oceans still waved against familiar shores. Their surfaces reflected light and weather, much as they always had. Currents continued to move energy around the globe, sustaining life that drifted, swam, and fed within layered waters. From above, nothing suggested fragility. The sea looked endless, generous, and full. Forests still stood across large stretches of land. Their canopies filtered light, their roots held soil in place, their slow cycles of growth and decay continued year after year. These were not empty landscapes. They supported insects, reptiles, and countless smaller lives moving through shade and leaf litter. The presence of trees gave the impression of permanence. Animals still walked the land. Footprints crossed dry ground and damp soil alike. Bodies moved according to routines shaped by long evolution. Feeding, resting, reproducing, and migrating followed patterns refined over deep time. Life occupied its spaces fully, interacting in ways that felt established and stable. And yet, beneath this familiar outline, the planet was already becoming something else. The transformation did not announce itself through loss of form. It unfolded through shifts in tolerance, balance, and flexibility. Systems that once carried excess now carried precision. Margins that once absorbed disturbance had narrowed. Earth had not lost its structure, but it had lost its ease. This world was still alive, but it required constant balance to remain so. Life persisted not because conditions were favorable, but because adaptation had become exact. The difference mattered, even if it could not be seen. Stability remained visible long after resilience had begun to fade. What makes this moment enduring is not the collapse that followed, but the lesson carried within it. A planet does not need to look broken to be under strain. Oceans can shine, forests can stand. Animals can walk the land. Change can still be underway. Earth's history reminds us that familiarity is not a guarantee of safety. Worlds transform quietly, guided by accumulation rather than spectacle. The most profound shifts often arrive without disrupting the surface that conceals them. 250 million years ago, Earth looked whole because it was still functioning, but function alone is not permanence. The planet had already crossed into a different state, one shaped by limits reached gradually and patiently. This was not the end of a world, it was the end of a condition. The familiar shape remained, even as its inner workings changed direction. And in that quiet difference, the future of life was already being written. The Earth that followed would carry echoes of this moment, not as memory, but as consequence. A reminder that beneath every calm surface, time continues its work, reshaping worlds long before they appear to change.